Hello, everyone. You are listening to the latest Flyers Talk podcast. I am Jordan Hall, and as always, I am joined by the dynamic Joe Fordyce. We are live at Rivers Casino in Philadelphia. And Joe, there seems to be a ton of discussion and focus on Flyers prospects right now. And that is probably a byproduct of a team that's in a rebuild. The future kind of comes to the forefront. And right now, it seems to be everyone talking prospects. And it reminds me a little bit of 2017-18, Joe, when the Flyers had 4 first-round picks over those 2 drafts. They got Nolan Patrick and Morgan Frost, and then Joel Farabee and Jay O'Brien in 18. And then Carter Hart was just starting to kind of sniff the NHL, and there was just a lot of talk about the youth of the organization. That's what it kind of reminds me of right now. I'm not sure I've seen this much discussion about prospects since then. So we figured, let's look at the top 5 prospects in our eyes in the organization. So we'll go from 5 to 1, Joe, and hammer them off. I'm eager to hear what you have. Let's start with number 5.
I'm going to go with defenseman Emil Andre. And this is where this is an area where the Flyers have to get better, and it's player development. He wasn't a first-round pick, 2020 draft. Now's the time where you need to see them develop a player like this. And when you look at the Flyers defense core, they need some youth in there. They just signed Travis Sanheim to a big deal. Ristolainen is a guy in the middle of his career. York is obviously what they hope to be the cornerstone of the defense core. They need another guy. And I'm not sure that I'm not sure that Zamula or Adard haven't really jumped out at you. They've maybe shown they can play third pair, something like that. But I don't think none of them have. Those 2 guys haven't jumped out at you like, wow, this guy. They haven't wowed anybody. And I think the Flyers need a guy that is pushing for one of the top 4 spots. And I think Andre can develop into that. So I would say number 5, and I feel like part of the reason I have him in number 5 is because I want to see the Flyers develop a player that's not like your first round pick, because a first round pick comes with the expectation this guy's going to turn into a player regardless. But the teams that win the Stanley Cup are the ones that find the later round picks and they develop them into great players. And I feel like that's what the Flyers need to do. They need to do it with a defenseman. So I'm going to go with Andre for my number 5.
That's a good one. And the Flyers have long needed some type of homegrown, long-term stability on the back end. They have not had that in a while. They've been looking for it. And I think a lot of people would agree the perennial contenders build from the back to the front, and they do it with homegrown talent. And we just have not seen the Flyers.
And they Hextall tried to do that when Ron Hextall was here with Provorov and with Sanheim. And I'm not saying that those guys are not good players, but Provorov obviously is now gone. And Sanheim, I don't know. Like, there's just feels like there's always this cloud over him. Like, when's he going to take that next step? And you'll see glimpses of the next step, and then you kind of still see this stuff that a young player, and we talked about this last year and the year before about how he needs to shed that young player sort of label and doing the things that the young player does. And I'm not sure he's totally done that yet. He did it for stretches of the last 2 seasons, but not totally. And so that's why I think this new regime needs to develop defensemen, homegrown defensemen, and I think Andre's the most likely candidate. And I'm not including Cam York in this because needs to be a home run pick because he was a first round pick and they passed on Cole Caulfield for him, and so in terms of a guy that they could develop, I'm going to go with Andre.
Yeah, and we're going to be looking at guys that haven't really established themselves at the NHL level yet. So Andre, a very good one that I think the organization is hoping he can become a foundation piece on their back end. Joe, I'm going with Bobby Brink at number 5. I think he's become a bit of a forgotten man because of last year and overcoming a torn labrum in his hip. He had surgery late in the offseason before last year, so his season was cut in half, and then he's playing catch up. So he was at the Phantoms for the most of the season. His numbers were okay, but he never really got back to the player that he was. I think now that he's healthy and he's had a summer where he can gain strength, he's going to be a guy to watch. Just 2 years ago, he led the nation in scoring. He had a national championship to his name, and he was making his NHL debut with the Flyers. He's only 22. He's still young, and a guy that can really play make, thinks the game at a high level, and a second-round pick in 2019. So a guy that's I think has become forgotten a little bit, but a guy that fans will want to watch. I think he's going to be pushing for the Flyers, and if he's not with the Flyers to start the season, he will be down in Lehigh Valley, I think, putting up points and kind of turning some heads. So I have Brink at number 5.
Yeah, that's a player too where you mentioned he's kind of forgotten, but the injury and 2 years ago when he came up, it was kind of like, let's see what we have. But Brink was a guy. I mean, Chuck Fletcher was very high on when they drafted him, and we only got to see a little bit of, and it was kind of, I would describe his minimal NHL experience as kind of nondescript when he came up. So yeah, that the Flyers also need to develop forwards that put up points and do it homegrown. I mean, so Konechny's a homegrown guy, but they haven't really had that either. They haven't really had the guy. I mean, which is, I guess, why we're having this conversation in the first place, is that they don't have a lot of recent homegrown talent or on the front or the back, really. Yeah. And I mean, okay, so Sean Couturier, Travis Konechny, but you need guys that can put up points. And Cam Atkinson in his 30s, it's not like he's going to be around forever. They need the next wave of guys after the Atkinsons, Sean Couturier, the Flyers' hope still has a lot of years left, but they need to look at the next wave of guys. Who are the next forwards that are going to come up? And, Brink is a guy that they were high on, and they need him. They need him to develop.
We've talked a lot about the organization's talent efficiency, and I think they're hoping Brink can kind of take a chunk out of that because he is a talented guy that can put up points, can score. Tinier kid, but I think has a second line ceiling, maybe a third line future, secondary scoring type, and just a real smart player and a guy that I think will be worth watching. Joe.
And if anybody knows about a guy that can score when they're small, it's Danny Briere.
Yeah.
So I think that's if you having Briere there, the type of player he was, the size he was, I think that is a good thing for some of those guys, because when you look around the league, you have guys that are smaller that just score goals, and that's okay. It seems like for a while this organization was not okay with the guy that just scores goals, and sometimes you need guys that just score goals. I mean, Alex Ovechkin just scores goals. I'm pretty sure the Caps are fine with that. Now, he's a leader and obviously an all-time great player, but really, like, the conversation about him starts and ends with goal scoring. It's okay to have players that are the primary focus is scoring goals. Yeah. Not saying Brink's going to be that, but he could.
Yeah.
And you have a guy like Danny Briere who really did that and did it at a similar size. So, I think that can only benefit.
Yeah, any small forwards in the organization, I think, are going to enjoy seeing Danny Briere as general manager because he's a guy that's been there, done it at that size. How about number 4, Joe? What are you going with?
Yeah, so number 4, I'm actually going to go in my list. I have 2 guys from this draft, and I'm going to go with Bonk here for number 2 because, again, it's another defenseman. He is a first-round pick, so there's sort of an assumption that he's going to be a good NHL player, but he's a lower first-round pick, so he needs some developing, and the Flyers need him to develop, again, because you need to look at the next wave. You need to look at the guys that are going to be playing with Cam York and with, if Emil Andre comes up to, like, that group of guys needs to develop. They need to develop 2 or 3 of those guys to be part of this defense core going forward. If they're going to do the things that Jonesy and Briere have talked about, they need these defensemen. And quite frankly, this team can't really afford to miss on a first round pick at this point. We've seen, I mean, Nolan Patrick was a different story because he was a really higher first round pick and injuries got in the way, but they can't afford to miss first round picks when you've made clear that the primary focus is building through the draft and building within before you're signing free agents. I mean, there was really not much activity free agent wise, so you need to build within. And if your primary focus is to build within, you pick the defenseman in the first round, he needs to develop. So I'm going to go with him.
And they're going to be patient with him. I think he's probably got 2 more years of junior hockey left before he even turns pro, and they're fine with that. To tell you how much they like Oliver Bonk is they passed up on Gabe Perreault to take him. Perreault was 132-point scorer, was one of the top scorers in that draft class, not named Connor Bedard, and they went with Bonk over him. So they really like Bonk, and I think they realized they needed to address defense.
Yeah, and the other thing, too, is with Oliver Bonk is that he's got a pedigree with his father, and I think it's helpful that his father wasn't a superstar, but his father had a long career in the league, so I don't think it's going to be this constant chase to live up to what your father did, like Wayne Gretzky, like one of Wayne Gretzky's sons never did, or in the NBA, in basketball, Michael Jordan's son. That is an impossible thing to live up to. But when it's a guy like Bonk, his father was a good player who had a long career, and so I think if you look around the league, like Adam Foote's son looks like he's off to a good start to his career, and Foote was a better player than Radek Bonk, but still, there's not this impossible legacy in front of you to live up to where somebody sees your last name and they say, oh, well, he's going to be a Hall of Famer. That's not. So I think that helps that you have the legacy and that extra help with your dad having played and can help you navigate your way through some of the things that your coaches and your GM, and they're not going to necessarily help you with some of the NHL life things. Your father can help you with that, and it's not like you're constantly in the shadow of what he did. So I think that's going to be a big help too.
Yeah, hockey blowlines definitely don't hurt. And if Flyers fans are looking for a junior team to watch this season, London will be one. That's where Oliver Bonk's going to be playing, and so is Denver Barkey, a Flyers prospect that the team also drafted in this most recent class, a smaller forward who can really score. So 2 Flyers prospects from this 2023 class will be in London playing there. So they're in the OHL. Definitely a team that I think will be worth keeping tabs on. Joe, I'm going with Emil Andre at 4. You had him at 5. I am at 4. I think it's fair to argue if Andre is the best defensive prospect in the organization right now. And he was a huge minute guy in the Swedish Elite League, which is the top pro league in Sweden. And that was at 21 years old. He played big minutes. He got better and better. I've had multiple people tell me he reminds them of Kimmo Timonen, and one of those people is not in the Flyers organization. He's a coach elsewhere. So to be compared to Kimmo Timonen, that's high praise. Small guy, competes his tail off, and he sees the ice. He can produce offensively. So I think Andre is going to be a guy that a lot of people have circled this year. He could flirt with the Flyers this season. He's expected to be with the Phantoms or the Flyers. It looks like he's definitely coming over here. He was at development camp and opened eyes. Brent Flair, the team's assistant GM, had a ton of good things to say about him. Thinks he's ready to play now, and he thinks John Tortorella is going to like this kid. So Andre is a defenseman that I think is right now the best prospect in the organization on the back end. So I have him at 4.
So let me ask you this, because I'm curious with a guy like Andre, if they have sort of like laid out expectations similar to the ones we've laid out during this podcast, and they need a fill-in. There's an injury or something like that where in the past Ronnie Attard, and we've seen, Igor Zamula. And do you think that they would be apt to bring Andre up and get a few games under his belt? Or do you think they would go with the guys who maybe like the Attards or the guys that have been there, and then just let Andre play out his, you, consistently play with the Phantoms.
Yeah, I think Andre's going to his opportunity with the Flyers. I think will be a byproduct of some injuries or perhaps some things not going the Flyers' way on the back end, and maybe they want to start looking at some more kids later in the season. I think one way he'll force the hand is just by winning over John Tortorella, and they're very high on him to the point where I think if he comes into camp and turns some heads, they'll make room for him because I thought we saw them do that last year where they made room for Zamula on the season opening roster, and he was in the season opening lineup. They were eager to look at a kid there, and Zamula got the call. I think they'll do the same. I think they're very much going to give opportunity to a kid if he proves he's ready. But at the same time, I think there's no rush, and he doesn't have a ton of experience in the AHL. He only got a cup of coffee at the end of the last year on the North American ice. So maybe I think in a perfect world, they have him start with the Phantoms.
Right. And I think, we heard John Tortorella last year a lot of times. It was like he emphasized how important it was that these guys get to play. Yeah. They get to play big minutes. They get to be in top roles, even if it is with the Phantoms, over, coming up and playing a couple games and maybe sitting in the press box for like that doesn't seem what they seem like what they want to do with the guys that they really have their sights set on as being the core of this team going forward. And that's an interesting approach because it's not been the approach in recent years for this team. Yeah. I'll say I don't think it's been prior to John Tortorella being here. I don't think that's necessarily been their approach.
Yeah, if you're looking for maybe a dark horse in camp, a guy that can maybe sneak up on people, I think Andre might be a good one because he very much, I think, is penciled to go to the Phantoms. But a guy that's going to push, no doubt about it. Catch all the sports action and more at Rivers Casino Philadelphia. Whether it's the money line or the pass line, there's something for everyone, including a great sports book. Rivers Casino Philadelphia. Philly loves a winner. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Joe, we're getting into that top three. Who do you have at number 3?
I'm going to go with Cutter Gauthier at 3 because now we're getting to the point with some of the guys that we've seen. Now, Cutter Gauthier, not in the NHL, but we've seen his college games are readily available, and he was a force on that Boston College team. Showed some struggles, defensively maybe in the bigger games that he was involved in, but a young player that's going to happen with a young player, and that also can be learned. But this guy can score, and we talked earlier about guys that can score. This guy, the Flyers, not only the Flyers need him to be here in the near future and score. That's what they need. That's why they drafted him. That's what he's shown, and he needs to show it for the Flyers. So to me, Gauthier, that has to be a can't miss prospect. It has to be a top 6 forward and really a big piece of this team going forward. That has to be a hit.
Yeah, they got him at number 5 in 2022. Top 5 picks you have to hit on. You can't miss on those. I think they've been really pleased with Gauthier. As you said, probably has the overall game to learn, but man, he can score, and he's done it at various levels, World Juniors, World Championships, and at Boston College. He'll be there for his sophomore season. I think we might see him at the end of the season if he signs his ELC.
Yeah, and we talked about this early. I mean, the Nolan Patrick pick and what that did, and the trickle-down effect for the next few years of missing on that pick, it really hurt. You don't overcome missing on a top 5 pick. So you can't miss. This can't be a miss. I don't think it will be. Yeah. So the sooner we see Cutter Gauthier in a Flyers uniform, the better.
Yeah. And speaking of offense, on the wing, Gauthier obviously is playing center in college, but he could be a wing too. I'm going with Tyson Forrester at 3, Joe. Might have the best shot in the organization, not just the prospect pipeline, but the organization. Really think it's up there. Had 7 points in that 8-game audition last season, opened the eyes of John Tortorella and others. I think he gave a nice little glimpse into the future last year at what he can do, and he fills just such a massive need, which is a shoot-first winger that the Flyers haven't had in a long time, a guy that can beat a goalie with no help. I think the sky's the limit for Forrester, and I really think in-house the organization feels super, super high on him. And among all these guys, he will also be pushing for the Flyers. Like if he's not down the road, I think his time is starting to get closer and closer here at the pro level.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me into my number 2 is
Perfect.
Forrester, and the reason is because in his audition, he was almost a point per game guy.
Yeah.
That is rare in itself that a guy comes up, has an audition like that, and starts to light up the score sheet right away. I mean, there's usually some sort of growing pains, and I'm sure there will be. We didn't see that when he first came up, and to me, that is why he's my number 2, is because he already showed us what he can do. It was hard to interview John Tortorella at any point last year and have him not bring up that guy, Tyson Forrester's name, at least during the back half of the season. And then how Tortorella took care of him with let me send him down to play in the big playoff games with Lehigh Valley. I think that had its sight set on like, do this year, because next year you're going to be up here this time. That's what I saw. So that to me is why he's my number 2, is because I think John Tortorella, with his plan last year and with this team's plan last year, and while the whole front office really wasn't in effect yet, the plan they ran through with Forrester last year, to me, set the table for this year, him establishing his NHL role, if not at the beginning. At some point during this season, Forrester will become an NHL player. And once he's there, I'm not sure he's going back down.
No, I agree. And he's got a little bit of a cockiness to him. And I mean it in a good way. It's a good cockiness. I've had people tell him he has a little bit of that personality in him. And I think you need that as a first-round prospect. You need to have some confidence. You have to think you're better than others. I think he has a little bit of that in him. He's got some swagger, some flair for the dramatic. To me, what he did against the Wild last year during his call-up, the Flyers are down 1 in the third period, and Forster just snipes a goal past Marc-Andre Fleury, one of the better goalies in the game. And that, to me, that's where you're like, wow, that kid could be something. He just tied the game, and the Flyers went on to win that game purely because of him. Just making something happen with his biggest strength. That's his shot. They didn't need a greasy goal. They didn't need someone battling in front of the net. He flat out just showed his biggest strength, and they went on to win that game. And you were thinking, hey, this is how this guy can impact this team.
And the two things you just said there, he sniped the goal, and the Flyers didn't need somebody grinding in front.
Yeah.
In recent years, there's been way too much guys that grind out in front, and there's not a whole lot else to their game. Wade Allison is the guy that comes to mind. Again, there's nothing wrong with guys that score goals.
Yeah.
That specialty is scoring goals. And it certainly looks like Tyson Forrester is that guy that has, not saying he doesn't have other skills, but that's his number 1 is scoring goals. And the Flyers need that. They need a lot of it.
They do. It's not a bad thing if that's your biggest strength. So, Joe, we had them flip-flopped. I have Cutter Gauthier at number 2. That was a tough call for me to the 2-3. He was a stud at World Juniors, a stud at the World Championship, and he led Boston College in scoring as a freshman. I think he's poised for a huge year as a sophomore, and I really think we could see him at the end of this season, depending on how the year goes for the Flyers. But a lot of people, I think most people, do not have them in a playoff race when the calendar turns to 2024. And I think that means at the end of his college season, he will be signing that entry-level deal, and we could see his NHL debut. I just think Gauthier will be a guy that is must-watch. If you can watch Boston College whenever they're on television, or if you can stream the games, do it.
Or listen to Al Morganti on pre- and post-game because he likes to talk about anyone from Boston.
Yep.
There's plenty of hockey in Boston, and he always talks about it. So,
That's right. And Gauthier he aced his first year as a Flyers prospect. I mean, literally did it at various levels. And I know this summer, too, at the World Junior Showcase, he dominated. So just a prospect that I think a lot of people are high on. National pundits are realizing it as well. So Cutter Gauthier, I have it number 2. Leads us into number 1. Who do you got?
And I think we're both going to have the same one here, but Matvei Mishkov as number 1. And here's why. Some of the things that were take all the Russia stuff and the contract in the KHL and all that out of it. There's some of the things that were being said about him when he got drafted, since he's been drafted. Eric Lindros might be the last player that the Flyers had at the beginning of their career that was talked about like this. Um, things like can't miss, cornerstone of the franchise, you know, the key to the rebuild, all of that sort of stuff. When the Flyers got Eric Lindros in the trade and the draft and the trade and the whole nonsense that went on there, they hadn't made the playoffs in. They had missed when they made the first time they made the playoffs with Lindros. It had been a 5-year absence in the playoffs. The situation seemed pretty familiar.
Yeah.
The way they acquired him is not familiar, and he's not doesn't have the star power that Lindros had, because he plays in Russia. So it's not everybody knows what goes on in the KHL all the time, and you really have to be a fanatical hockey person to know that stuff. But in terms of the skills, Lindros is the last guy that they've taken that has been talked about this way, and he has to be their number one prospect. There's just no way around it.
Yeah, no, I have him at 1, and for me, what sold me on number 1 was when Danny Briere said at the draft that the Flyers have no one like this kid in the organization, and that tells me he's a different type of talent, and he's clearly the top prospect in their pipeline, and for good reason. I think there's a ton of hype around Mishkov Joe. I think people are going to try to find his games via live stream in Russia, and they're going to watch him a ton. And if they don't watch him, I think they're going to see his highlights probably circulate Twitter and YouTube, and people are always going to be on his elite prospects page, just seeing what he's doing numbers wise.
It also seemed that there was a lot of chatter that if he didn't have the Russia situation, that he could have been like 1A to Bedard.
Yeah.
You hear a little bit of that stuff. I mean, if he's anywhere like close to that, I mean, I think the Flyers think that they got a steal getting him where they got him. And the other thing you're going to have is fans and people trying to figure out a way he can get here quicker than 3 years or, whatever the years may be. Because you've heard every time I talk to anybody about this guy, it's all about, well, I think he'll be here after this many years. I think he'll be here after. Everybody wants to know when's the first time he's going to be here, and so they can see him. So I think it's been a while since the fan base and the team have been excited about a player like they're excited about this player from the jump. And it's good to see. So he has to be their number one prospect, and has to live up to that billing, really.
Yeah, if you're going to take him at number 7 overall, like we've talked about hitting on picks, and there was some risk involved. That's why Mishkov fell to number 7, is because there was risk involved. But for a team like the Flyers, they felt like that risk was worth the potential reward. I mean, he's touted as game-breaking and franchise-altering. So we'll see how he develops over in Russia, how the relationship with the Flyers, how that goes over the next 3 years, as it's projected that he could be there for 3 seasons in the KHL, the contract that he signed. But when he gets here, I think, and if he gets here, there's excitement that he's a top-end talent. And I think the consensus with the Flyers needed to take a swing on talent. They need more talent like that in the organization. That's part of rebuilding, is you can't get middle-of-the-road talent. You need to get high-end talent, and he's high-end.
Yeah, and what you just said there, franchise-altering. When is the last time you heard that about a player? We didn't hear it about Nolan Patrick.
No.
I mean, when you talk franchise altering, the players you're thinking are like Austin Matthews, Connor McDavid. I mean, I mentioned Lindros, Sidney Crosby. Like, that's not a label that's given to a lot of players. And I don't think a lot of labels become overused. I don't think that one has particularly been overused, and it's being used about this kid. So remains to be seen. But anytime you hear that, we might look back on this and wonder how the Flyers got him at 7. Hopefully we do.
Yeah.
And, so the circumstances, and again, taking a chance on talent, because teams that win, they win because they take chances on certain guys. And this is one of them. And the Flyers hope it pans out.
Yeah. And the Flyers will definitely be keeping tabs on Mishkov and seeing how he's doing. And I'm sure they're going to be excited about him if he's playing well over there in the KHL, Russia's top pro league. And I think there's a decent amount of excitement and buzz about Flyers prospects. So we'll continue to cover them throughout this Flyers rebuild. Uh, all these kids, I think, are going to be worth keeping tabs on. Some we might see in a Flyers jersey soon, some down the road. But we'll have it all covered on NBCSportsPhiladelphia.com and on Flyers Talk Podcast. Joe, thank you so much. Fun to talk prospects in August. Before you know it, it'll be September and training camp will be here, and we'll be talking about the big club. But thank you so much. Great seeing you. Great chatting with you. Ben Berry, our podcast producer, a big thank you to him as well. And Flyers fans, of course, as always, thank you so much for listening to the latest Flyers Talk podcast. Wherever you get your podcasts, please rate and subscribe. And we can't wait to talk to you next time.